Marvin Smith, your host of Funding Bravely, a podcast about courage and philanthropy, what it looks like, why it matters, and how we grow it. For nearly 20 years, I've worked at the intersection of philanthropy, policy, and storytelling, building bridges between donors, communities, and ideas that change systems. I helped launch an equity-centered research and development fund that's mobilized a significant amount of philanthropic commitments. I've led coalitions that have secured federal investments that expand opportunity for students nationwide. Funding Bravely brings the same spirit to this moment. Each episode surfaces the unseen courage of leaders challenging power, moving money faster, and reshaping what justice-rooted action can look like. The goal here isn't just to admire courage, it's to spread it, and to inspire every listener to fund more bravely. I'm really excited to welcome Darren Isom to Funding Bravely today. Darren's a partner at the Bridgespan Group San Francisco office, where he advises mission-driven organizations and foundations working toward equity and justice. He also helps lead Bridgespan's efforts to advance racial equity and philanthropy and deepen partnerships with arts and cultural organizations. I have to say as well, I'm a huge fan of Darren's own podcast, Dreaming in Color, which creates a space for leaders of color to share how they've used their experiences and brilliance to drive change and redefine success. It's an honor to have him on Funding Bravely, especially after having had a chance to collaborate with him on a nonprofit board of directors in Texas some years ago now, Darren. Shout out to Ali Mayet for bringing us together, too.
Shout out to Ali.
Yeah. Darren, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Marvin, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And it's also just wonderful to have your voice in this conversation.
Well, Darren, let's get into it. You said joy and optimism, are acts of resistance. What's been keeping you hopeful or even laughing lately in the midst of so much going on?
Marvin, it's a great question. I've found that I am an eternal optimist. And so early in my career, I thought of myself as a cynic. But the more my career plays out, I realize what an optimist I am. I talk all the time about how I had a therapist many years ago who talks about how sometimes hope comes from experience. And I think that when you've lived through things as a community, as a people, generationally and otherwise, you can see the other side of this. You may recognize that it's going to be a long road, but you recognize that we'll come out of this and we'll come out of this stronger. I think from an optimism perspective as well, I get to talk with people like you, people in the sector who are absolutely brilliant. And I joke all the time, it's like, I don't know if we're going to win, but we got our best people working on it. And that's all you can ask for in the moment. I think that also just Black America, and we're just naturally, we find humor in things. I think we've managed to understand the role of humor in joy in the darkest moments as a form of resistance, as a way of understanding our place in the world, but also our way of navigating through it. And so that gives me great joy, great optimism, great hope. I've shared this with you before. I think that at the end of the day, when we look at the fullness of time, a conversation I had with my colleague, Jamie Allison, who's at Haas Junior Fund in California, we're living through a very unique and interesting period. Focus on the word living, right? We're getting through this for sure. And with that, I think it's worth noting that we have fundamentally changed as a society in the past 5 or 10 years. I think that we've changed who we are. We changed how we think about life. We've changed what success looks like. I think a lot of the conversations we're having now is because of that change. I think that we've gone through a bit of a growth spurt. Doesn't feel like that all the time, but we've gone through a growth spurt from an equity perspective, from a life perspective. And with all growth spurts, you wake up and you realize your clothes, your systems, your narratives don't fit anymore. And that's where we are in this new body, naked as hell, trying to look for something to cover ourselves with. We're going back in the closet, pulling out clothes from 1950. Clearly, that don't work either, right? So I think that we're on the search for new things, new systems, new approaches. And I think it's folks like you and others in the space that are giving us these new systems, these new narratives to live into. And so that brings me hope, lots of hope.
Well, thank you for that, Darren, and making space for joy as well. Let's embrace it, right, and invite it into the conversation.
I think the joy is there. And so I think that is important for us to note. I think that joy, particularly as communities of color, is our greatest resource. I think that we have a community joy, we have a community pride, and that joy, it's an unlimited resource that we have to rely on and live through. And there is in that joy the ability to see a new world and imagine a new world that is really powerful and meaningful. So definitely live into it.
Darren, I want to invite you from that point just to think back in some of your earliest years in life and think about courage. If you could share with us one of your earliest experiences of courage in your personal life. How did it shape the kind of leader you've become? I think we need a lot more of it today, especially in philanthropy. And I know that it didn't just start with where you are now and at Bridgespan Group.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You know, funny enough, I don't think of myself as all that courageous. I think of myself as living a fairly normal life. The older I get, the more I recognize what a beautiful, privileged bubble or an island my parents made for me growing up. And so I talk about how, I grew up in New Orleans. I'm a New Orleans boy, 7th-generation New Orleans native. I was expatriated to California. I'm in California now. And my family's been in New Orleans now for 9 generations. And as a 7th-generation New Orleans native, I am the only generation that went to integrated schools. They were de jure, so legally segregated before me, and de facto segregated after me because all the whites left the city. There were no whites to go to public schools. And I remember, I think about this now, but didn't notice at the moment. Like my parents met integrating a high school in New Orleans. My mom's the same age as Ruby Bridges, right? And so my parents grew up in very different social environment. My dad came from a wealthy Black New Orleans family. My mom came from a working class Black family. Neighborhoods 8 blocks away from each other, but 2 worlds that would never cross if it weren't for integration. My dad got pulled out of the Black Catholic prep school. My mom got pulled out of the Black test public school, if you will, the Booker T. Washington that every Black city had. And they went to this white high school. They were integrated in a white high school. And they went off to college, came back to the city, and they raised us in an integrated New Orleans. And there was so much effort to make integration work. My parents pulled me out of the Black Catholic elementary kindergarten. I was in St. Joan of Arc, the Black Catholic. And almost has this tradition of like, protect your wealthy Black kids, put them in these Black Catholic prep schools, right? They're like, he's got to learn how to work with white people. Like, you can't, this is the way of the world, right? And so they put me in the integrated school, the Willow School. The name says it all, right? It was like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 Black, 1/3 white, 1/3 other. And we had this hippy dippy educational experience. It was all, literally, we were singing the Beatles before the day started with Miss Ziegler as our Black teacher with an afro. It was in the 80s. It was too late to be wearing an afro, but she was wearing an afro, singing in the morning, and Project Pride, all about diversity and all these things. And education was so, important, but really appreciating our multiculturalism and differences. And so we were raised as generation integration. Right. It was not assimilation, it was integration, right? We were brought in, we normalized this idea of working with others, living with others. We normalized this idea of Black excellence and community pride. We normalized all these things from Sesame Street to 3-2-1 Contact to Mr. Rogers. Like there was an active world normalizing all these things that were just radical. Now, when you think about it, right? It was so different from the world we'd lived in, or my parents had lived in. In the fullness of time, I was generation integration. I thought all those things were normal. And so much of my professional world weren't necessarily acts of courage in that sense. It was my living into the world that I normalized. I didn't realize what a radical world I'd normalize from an integration perspective. And so everything from, my not necessarily being intimidated by white people, I never found white people, I was not intimidated by white people. I normalized that world and working with white people, working with white funders, working with nonprofits. I also normalized the idea of Black excellence, Black genius. I normalized my role as a strategist and making sure that those Black leaders were able to shine in the world and the space. I normalized things like that are, seemingly radical in some ways. This idea that the community has the best answer. Wow, go figure. That nonprofits shouldn't be trying to put themselves out of business. They should be trying to be durable institutions that last and are well funded.
I hear the other way around sometimes. We're going to have to get back to that later in the conversation.
Totally. This idea that, that there's such a thing as too much money, right? This idea that power and corruption are linked to some degree. And so there was so much that I normalized. And I think that my career in many ways has been living out the beautiful world that I was raised in, and living out the vision that folks had for our generation. I feel that as a Gen Xer, there's an obligation. We lived in a very beautiful world. in which so many things were normalized. And I realize now that that world was kind of a Truman Show. We were the ones that were living in the blip, if you will, right? You look at us like, they didn't watch Mr. Rogers? They did not watch Mr. Rogers. I don't know what they were watching, right? And so much of my job, generationally speaking, is making sure that beautiful world that was normalized for me is normalized for others.
I'm glad we started there, and how great it is to not have to assimilate to other cultures that are really different than yours at the expense of what you know to be true. Darren, you've described yourself as a nomenclator before, somebody who both names things and announces people to the room. You're naming something as integration here in your story about your upbringing more than assimilation. And that led to some power, it sounds like, that you were able to touch and feel and embrace and grow that shaped some of your leadership. How does naming shape power in philanthropy?
What a great question. And so I think that, I talk about that nomenclature piece because it's something that's very important to me. I say all the time about how my role at Bridgespan and just my larger role philanthropically and strategically in the sector has been both naming ideas in a way that make them understood, engaging, sexy, interesting. And the more archaic definition of a nomenclator is when you walk into the king's room, you would hand your calling card to the nomenclator and he would announce you to the room. So it's really announcing the people. It's like, I don't know the answer, but here's the person I trust with the answer. I think from a philanthropic perspective, I think what's interesting when you think about that work in those roles, I think it's important for us to recognize the power that we have in this moment. I'm an optimist. I think that we're in many ways fighting the fight of the 50s and the 60s again, but we're better resourced. We're better organized. We have more funds. We have more organizations. And we also have a better understanding of the world around us that'll make that fight easier. And so I think that, when we think about philanthropy, this is what's interesting about the role of philanthropy in the sector. I think that, 5-10 years ago, and I'll throw myself under the bus. I joked at Bridgespan, we were really good at the theory of changes. I've created some beautiful theories of changes for funders, right? And I stand by those. They were great items. They were beautiful documents. And I still believe that funders should work under a theory of change. But in the older days, if you will, funders would have these amazing theory of changes where they would name things, they would name areas of work, they had these beautiful boxes, and they would look to nonprofits as vendors for their strategies. Right. And I think that now we realize that it's actually the nonprofits that should have the theories of changes, the beautiful boxes, and be able to name the work and the thinking and the people. And funders should act as supporters, advocates, and funders of that work and that thinking. That's a huge shift that I think brings about a better answer, but it takes a totally different way of thinking about the work and the answer itself. It requires funders to recognize they're in a servant role from a funding perspective, that they actually don't have proximity from an impact and engagement perspective, and that proximity is a missing ingredient to drive success. So it requires them to really think about how they're partnering with organizations that are driving the work at a local level, how they're not only funding that work, but also how they're using their other forms of power to bring others along to the work, to name others in the work and the thinking, and to cultivate funders and funder learning, which is almost like a radical term, funder learning, funders changing and thinking differently about the work based on what they're seeing in the nonprofit sector. And so I think so much of my work in philanthropy is about repositioning funders and having them think about their power differently, and also elevating the obvious genius that exists at the community level and with community leaders themselves.
I love that. Darren, and when I think about courage and philanthropy, initially between grant seeker and grant maker, there's a difference in power dynamic often that I think one would go to pretty quickly when thinking about where courage is really needed. But you're highlighting a different ethos for philanthropy to embrace and how it works. And I would imagine not everyone you've come across has shared your worldview on what this should look like, and where there should be more focus directed on toward the theories of actions from nonprofits rather than setting the stage from the philanthropy. Could you think about a time where if courage is not what resonates for you, or the listeners can determine whether there is some of that at play, where you've maybe been met by a closed door or some resistance around shifting in this way for how you'd operate as a philanthropist?
I think this speaks to a huge shift that's happening within the sector more broadly. 20 years ago, funders came over from the private sector. So you have these people who amass large amounts of money in the private sector, and they came to the nonprofit. They came to fund as a way of, I joke, trying to get into heaven before they died. Right? It was like, let me, let me go over here and fund some folks. Right? But it was done, right? And it was done with a real. It was like, I've made all the success and making money. How do I use that success and those learnings to give away money? I think at some point people realize, okay, maybe not all those skills are transferable. I mean, we're living in a capitalist society. If you can't manage to make money in this system, child, you really should find another game. Like, everything's set up for you to make money, right? Through exploitation and otherwise. I think at some point people realize, okay, maybe not all the skills are transferable. Maybe only a few of them are transferable. And so you've had conversations where folks talking about, like, how do we scale this? How do we think about this? Like, well, this is what worked in the private sector. It's like, honey, that's not going to work in the nonprofit sector, right? Like, that's just, it's a very different approach to thinking and what impact looks like. And then I think at some point they realized, well, maybe not all, maybe some. And then at some point it was like, maybe none of these skills are, like, maybe none of these things are transferable. Like, maybe like the systems and approaches that I use to amass money at ends, a contradiction of the ones that I should use from a values perspective to give away money. I think that's been a big shift in people realizing that private sector rules don't work. People say more recently, like, don't say the values, say what you value. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, and so I think what you value is different in the nonprofit side of things. Right. I think you're seeing with younger generations, I mean, and even take that way of thinking even further, you have, daddy amassed $1 billion. And a reminder to folks, $1 billion is 1,000 millions. Right. Where people literally worth 10,000 millions. Right.
Yeah.
If not more, who are arguing over $100,000 grant. Like, what is going on here? Like, this is foolishness, right? I think that the younger generations, their kids come in, they're like, actually, you do not amass 1,000 millions without doing harm to the world. How do we use our philanthropy to repair the harm that we have offered the world? And that is such a different way of thinking about both wealth, is such a way of thinking about philanthropy that I think that speaks to there's such a huge shift in what success looks like and how we think about the work itself. You're entering from a place of a healing, a place of, let me fix. Like, my wealth is actually not the solution. My wealth is the problem, right? My power is the problem, right? So it's a very different way, very different orientation around privilege. And I think it also requires you to recognize the inherent genius that exists in the communities and organizations that are closer to the solutions to the community itself. And so I think there's a shift in power that we've seen play out that's really pronounced and very meaningful, that gives us a very different way of thinking about the work. I think that you also see in many ways, you see the pushback, right? Mm-hmm. You see people recognizing that their power is problematic, not well earned, and doing harm. And I can only imagine. I had a funder at some point. We're talking about a larger issue, and they recognized that they were a problem to some degree. And this funder, you have to push him back on several calls. Called him, use a Harry Potter analogy. Our girl, Rollin, she's a problem, but here we are. She's like, well, Darren, I appreciate the call yesterday and had some time to think about it, and totally agree with how you're thinking about it and the way we're moving forward. But you have to appreciate it's really hard when you go to bed thinking you're Team Gryffindor and realizing you're not even Slytherin, you might be a Death Eater. Right? That realization is real, right? And so I think that takes a shift, and no one wants to feel guilty. No one wants to feel any degree of culpability. And so we create these elaborate narratives to escape culpability. And so I think that really unpacking those and having folks work through those is a way to get at that. But I think straightforwardly, finding brilliant organizations, brilliant leaders that people can get their support behind is the easiest way for people to work around that and work through that from a learning perspective.
Yeah, really a beautiful example of the importance of why examining our own identities before we make tremendous shifts to the way that we're moving money as philanthropists is critical for us to be effective and push back against some of those challenges that may be impacting more good that we can do with the resources that we've amassed.
100%.
Ways that are problematic, as you talked about oftentimes. So where do you see let's lift up, are there bright spots that you see in philanthropy today in the sector where folks are starting to embrace new ways of thinking around their role in philanthropy, how they get toward the impact that they might be desiring with the wealth that they have to give?
Yes, I think there are lots of bright spots. And so there's all forms of reasons for optimism in this space now. I mean, I talked about the larger narrative shift that's happened within the philanthropic world, and that's playing out clearly. I had an old mentor of mine, Irva Shivade, who's since passed. And I remember this was at a Donors of Color Network event. I'm on the board of Donors of Color Network. We were having a retreat of some sort, and she couldn't attend. She was dealing with cancer at the time, which eventually took her out. But she, got on the Zoom, it was Zoom days. She looked at the room. We'd spent the last 2 days talking about we're going to fix the world and all the things, and it felt so chaotic. And she said, looked at us, and I'm sure we looked a hot mess, honestly, because we'd been working hard and overwhelmed. And she's like, I know the world feels overwhelming right now. It's very easy for you to feel some degree of hopelessness, but I just want you to know that this is what winning looks like. Winning looks like chaos. When you're uprooting broken systems and creating new ones, keep pushing, keep carrying on the work, right? And so I think that the world that we're in now, one of chaos, is one of people making all types of realizations, people holding dearly to the work that they know does not work, their approaches and their power. And I think that we are winning the narrative game from an impact perspective, what success looks like. And at any given moment, there are two battles happening. There's a legal battle that happens in the courts and the law houses and the governor mansions, and there's a kitchen table battle. And Donald Hollowell, old civil rights attorneys, talk about how like those two battles, you win and lose the courtroom battles. The wins come few and far between, but you can never lose the kitchen table battle. Right. And we're winning the battle for the narrative. It doesn't feel that way, but we're winning the battle for the narrative. And we're trying to have the courts catch up, and they're fighting like hell. Ooh, goodness. The way they're fighting. Right. It's the whole extinction theory. Right. The fight is all the shadows are always tallest right before the sun sets. Right. So I think that, that I think is important to note. I think there's been a shift in how we think about the work. I think that newer generations have normalized the world that I'm talking about in ways that are important and meaningful. I think that we're seeing philanthropy respond accordingly as well. And so I think that, there's so much talk about the foundations that pull back from equity funding in the last, 3-4 years. For the record, a lot of these folks that are pulling back were never about the work anyway. This is just, it gave them permission to step away from work that they weren't doing, right? A lot of promise funds that were never made. I think that you see a whole set of foundations that are living into the work more deeply, that are giving away larger amounts of money, that are definitely more steadfast and thoughtful about the work and the thinking and understand their role more clearly. I think you're also seeing, and we take for granted the fact that as much as 50% of the country's lost their mind, another 50% is pretty, grounded and understand the work and the thinking. And so you have the rise of two levels of funders that you didn't really think of as sustainable funders in the past. You have individual contributors, so folks that, are committed to organizations. They're moving in different paths. I joke all the time as an organization. If you have someone who's been giving you $1,000, now's the time to ask them for $10,000. If you have someone who's been giving you $10,000, now's the time to be asking for $100,000. Like we're in a new generation. It's like you look up as someone's raised. It's like, wait, I'm only giving them $2,000. How they want $10,000? Like, oh, you're supposed to be giving $10,000 now. This is your time, right? Step it up. So you see definitely in individual funders that are giving more, and a cultivation of that base, but also they're bringing others along, right? They're using their influence to bring others along because you're giving them a space and an understanding and a commitment and a connection to the organization and a success. You're also seeing the rise of high net worth donors. You see the massing of funds, a lot of people who are not comfortable with holding on to that much money. For the record, you definitely have some folks that are more than happy to have $10,000 million just lying around. And, I was talking with a mentor in Sacramento, Tina Roberts, and I was saying it's just so bizarre. Like, these folks are holding on to this money. How much money do you need? Like, I don't get it. She's like, it's called greed, honey. This is old. This is not new. Like, this Bible writes all about it, right? Yeah. So you have folks that are greedy as hell. Yeah. And they have a level of wealth and security that just blows my mind, right, as they amass the billions. But you also have folks, usually their wives, who are like, this makes I'm so happy whenever there's a divorce, because that usually means that some woman's going to take her half and like spend it down, right? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so I think that they just live differently. They value different things. And those folks are less about setting up a $1 billion foundation where they give away 5 or 10% a year, and more about, here's $1 billion, spend that down in 10 years, right? And the good trouble you can get into when you're spending down a large amount of money in a short period of time from a transfer of power perspective, and the ability to create durable organizations that live past this moment that we're in, I think that's really a bright spot. 2 quick thoughts on that. Everyone should read this piece by Darren Isom. It's from a few months ago. Where she talks about this period reminding her a lot of the post-Reconstruction period. So, of course, Reconstruction, slavery ended, amendments were added. There was kind of a bit of a progressive era from a law's perspective, and blacks achieved great things during that period, from our first black legislators, black senators, black governor in Louisiana, and others. And the rise of the black middle class and wealthy black community in a short period after slavery ended. And then you had the post-Reconstruction period, where it was violently taken away. It was a very violent period in American history, literally. I mean, lynchings, all the things. In New Orleans, there are 1,000 statues dedicated to a number of black people that were killed during that period. But we don't talk about it because it doesn't fit the larger black American narrative. And she talked about, let's not forget that it was during that nadir that was the post-Reconstruction period, a dark point, that the Harlem Renaissance happened, that the NAACP was founded, that the Schoenberg Center was started, that the first Black Labor Union was started. It was during that extremely dark period that Black America realized that we had to plant seeds that we may not, as a generation, see grow. So how do you live through this period, but how do you plan for what comes after this? How do you look past this period? And I think that the ability to really envision a new world and create that world, we're living in a moment for builders. Folks that are not about protecting the current system that we know is broken, but are thinking about what we're going to put in its place, because the center cannot hold in this moment. And so I think that this is a moment for builders, people that are really thinking about what success looks like in 10 years out, the way that our ancestors did, and are building that world. And so that brings me some optimism, and that's what good looks like, particularly in the philanthropic space, because people are thinking about what are the organizations and leaders that we need 10 years from now, and how do we set them up now, particularly in this moment. And I think there's also been a real strong, people understand the importance of durability. Seeing so many things just being taken away, people understand the importance of creating durable institutions, durable movements, durable ideas, and funding in a way that's at scale to create that durability.
Yeah, I love how you've gone back in history and looking at some really important moments where in the downfall of certain systems, where we've been challenged as a people, where it's given space for the birth of something new, more powerful, wilder than our biggest imaginations. You've painted a vision for what that can look like for philanthropy moving forward in this next chapter. A last question here for you, Dan. Where do you find community right now? Where do you find your people who are doing this work and helping to build on the optimism that you have for this moment?
You know, I mean, Marvin, going back to the earlier comment, as I started the conversation, the community is what brings me joy right now. And so there are so many amazing people carrying out great work. We are in such good company. The level of black and brown brilliance is just, and my bar for brilliance is high. Like, I don't call anybody brilliance. There's some smart folks out here carrying out this work and the thinking. That are gifted with generations worth of knowledge, but also we understand our role in this space, in this time. I was in DC a few months back. One of my mentors at Howard, something about the world that we're in. He was like, well, there's always been a space for the gay black strategists. I was like, well, I'm no Bayard Rustin, but or Elaine Locke, right? But here we are, and I think that we're all living into those roles. We are community-driven people, and so we find and we make community easily. I think that those spaces come about through the organizations that we're in, through the connections that we've made, through the work that we've done. They come about through project work. They come about through my event in Martha's Vineyard, where I get to connect with the various folks in the work and doing the space and the thinking. They come about through just genuine relationships that you have with the folks that you went to school with, that you had lunch with. some of y'all went to Jack and Jill with, right? Like these are the folks that at the end of the day become the leaders in the space and the thinking. Black Americans are really, really good at this. There's this Bill Cunningham was the old New York Times fashion photographer. He was, I don't know if you followed him at all. He was an amazing fashion photographer. He would go and look at the fashion women on the Upper East Side on 79th and Madison, and then would come down and watch the B-boys play basketball in the West Village, and he could see fashion, all those things, right? And so I just think about his hilarious commentary because he really saw the fashion. He understood fashion. But his famous quote was, "He who seeks beauty will find it." And I think that Black Americans we seek beauty, know what beauty looks like. So many of us are motivated by faith in this work. I was hit through all the radical progressive. Everybody was doing a job on me, right? And my grandmother, a very Catholic New Orleans grandmother, used to always say, let's remember liberation theology, that God's greatest gift to man was that of free will. If he wanted us to all be the same, he would have made us all the same. It was that easy. And our gift back to God, our gift back to our beautiful maker is living our lives as beautifully as possible, right? And our gift to each other is making space for each of us to live out our beauty as God commanded it, right? And so I think that as a community, I mean, that's New Orleans Catholicism.
Amen to that.
That's the Catholics that gave you Mardi Gras religious holiday, right? But I think that there is, there's some amazing way. I think that Black Americans are expert connecting with people, understanding their role in their space, and understanding that we all have lanes in this work, and all those lanes are on a beautiful highway, right? And so they continue to care out their work in a way that's meaningful and thoughtful, to connect with people that all have their role on this freedom highway. And we all have a God-given role in creating beauty for the community and the world that we have to have the space to carry out, and the funding. As a funder, my job is to make sure these folks get the funding to carry out their work at scale, right? We all have a role, and that's my role. It's actually an easier role than the others who are carrying out the work and the thinking. So.
Well, Darren, thank you so much. This has been a beautiful conversation. Lots of great nuggets for our listeners. I love how you've highlighted so powerfully that beauty and community is around us. You've really explained the power of knowing where you come from, knowing what vision that you're working toward, what it looks like if we're seeking to tear down some systems that haven't served us well and replace them with something new, more compelling. We've got to know what that looks like, and that there's a lot of folks around us doing wonderful work. So it's been 100%. A treat to get to spend this time with you.
Thank you. I want to leave just one on a closing note. I mean, I was lucky for my podcast to spend the last season in Africa. So we did some 6 countries over the course of some 3 weeks, some 9 conversations, everywhere from South Africa to Ethiopia, Nigeria, Senegal, Tunisia, and Kenya. And when we were in Ethiopia, it was actually a beautiful conversation. I was talking, I joked that it was the first time I recognized my role as a Black American in the larger Black diaspora. The Black Americans, we visit Africa, we are totally the crazy, rich, fun cousins, right, of the diaspora. And so we're keeping everybody laughing, we're joyful. And we have an optimism embedded in the work and the thinking. And my guide in Ethiopia pointed that out. He was like, I just love traveling with Black Americans. You guys are just so joyful. You're just an optimistic group. And I said, yes, we tend to be optimists to some degree, especially me. But I was like, but it's been really hard to be an optimist these last few months. It's back in April. And so we're dealing with administration changes and crazy folks at all levels of government and whatnot and so forth. And he stopped me at the end of that sentence. He's like, no, your optimism is most important now. Our torchbearers are most important when it's dark out. And so, I mean, I just want to close in reminding you, remind the leaders in this space that this is really when our torchbearers shine. This is when we have to remind folks that we as a community, maybe not generationally, I joke all the time, like we as Black people have gone through, I've never gone through this stuff before, but we as Black folks have gone through this stuff before, right? And that we will get through this. And I truly believe that we will be better because of it. I think this is when Black folks shine. Right? This is when we shine. And I think that Black genius, when given the space to create new things as opposed to navigate broken things, when we're given the space to actually create new things, we create beautiful, amazing things. And so I think this is really a moment for builders, brilliant, strategic builders. And I encourage them, you particularly as well, to live into this moment and think about what's the world that we want for our grandchildren. Past this, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. My dad used to always joke, Black leaders, they get to fantasize about 3 generations, right, from now, all right? What's the world that we want to create for them? And what are we putting in place now? What are the seeds that we're planting now that they will get to take advantage of from our fruit of our labor?
Well, I'm walking away inspired, Darren. Thank you for imparting so much rich knowledge on all of us. If you're sad this conversation today is coming to a close like I am, encourage you to check Darren out on his Dreaming in Color podcast. 5 seasons in, is that right?
5 beautiful seasons. Seasons. And Marvin, you'll appreciate that I am laughing in every episode. Those conversations have been so healing for me because folks are smart and funny. And yeah, we're going to get through this. We're going to come out on top.
Yes. Well, take a look at Dreaming in Color, available on all of the podcast platforms that are out there. You can catch more of Darren and his takes. Darren, thank you so much for joining Funding Bravely. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Marvin. Talk soon.